Hi, I'm Caroline DeVoy. I am a CPA that runs a small accounting firm that services small and medium-sized businesses. Over the last couple of years, we've had an opportunity to work with two interior designers that are using Studio Designer for their accounting package. And this is the video I wish I had found before I dove into Studio Designer because it would have saved me an awful lot of time. So this is going to give you just a quick overview of how Studio Designer works and how it thinks. First, I'm not affiliated with Studio Designer, so they have no responsibility for what I am about to say. Studio Designer is an incredible idea. The idea that they allow you to track things at the item level versus at a macro invoice level is really a game changer for interior designers. When you're ordering hundreds of items for a customer, it would be so easy to lose track of what you've invoiced them for, what you've paid your vendors for. And Studio Designer really allows you to narrow it down to the item level and track it that way. However, I'm going to say from their execution of an accounting package, I'm going to give it a grade of fair. It is handling a lot of detailed information, but there are certainly things that I think they could have streamlined and made easier to handle. It's also not the worst accounting system that I've ever seen. In fact, far from it. Like many accounting packages that are industry vertical packages, I think the accounting side is often introduced after the core functionality of the purchasing. And I think what happens in those cases is sometimes they're stuck with decisions they made early on that might not be best for accounting. So my warning with Studio Designer is it just needs to be understood and managed. That's where I see designers get in trouble because they don't understand how it works, and they're either not managing it themselves or they've not delegated someone to manage it for them. You have to understand some accounting basics to even use it. So I'll make this as painless as I can. Let's first start talking about the balance sheet, which is one of the financial reports that you can generate out of Studio Designer. First, a balance sheet is a listing of assets and liabilities. And just to help you remember, assets are things like cash, accounts receivable, furniture, and fixtures. They're items that have value that you own. Liabilities, on the other hand, are monies that you owe other people. Those would be items like accounts payable, your credit card payable, your bank loans payable. Something to note about the balance sheet is the balance sheet runs from the very beginning of your business up until a particular point in time. So you'll see in the header of a balance sheet, it will designate what date they're using. It will say as of 12/31/2023, for example. That means it includes all the activity of the business up until December 31st, 2023. So if you want to compare it to, if you want a school analogy for this, consider it a permanent record of your business. Another way to look at your balance sheet is to realize that it's showing you how you acquired your business assets. Did you borrow to get them, or did you use equity? Equity is a fancy word for the company's past profits and any contributions the owner has made. I would argue that the balance sheet is the most important financial statement because it truly is the permanent record of the business. So now let's go over and look at the income statement, which you may have heard called the profit and loss or the P&L. They're all the same thing. In comparison with the balance sheet, it is a listing of revenue and expenses. Revenue less expenses gets you net income or net profit, and recognize that net income and net profit are just different words for the same thing. An income statement, as contrasted to the balance sheet, is for a period of time, usually monthly or annually. So in the header of an income statement, it will say for the period June 1 to June 30, 2024, for example. That will tell you that the income statement is for the month of June. Back to the school analogy, Think of it as the semester's report card for your business. It's just showing whether or not the business was profitable for a specific period of time. It's not saying what assets you own. It's not saying how much you owe vendors. The income statement is an important financial statement, but if the balance sheet is not correct, the income statement will not be correct either. So you've already graduated to Accounting 201. Let me say that I want to look at you've already graduated to Accounting 201. Here we'll explore why an accrual-based accounting system is different than a cash-based. In accrual basis accounting, you are attempting to accurately match the revenue to the expenses associated with it. By contrast, a cash basis accounting system only records activity when cash is exchanged, so there is not a good matching of revenue and expenses. Let me give you an example. You purchase a table for $100 and you sell it to the client for $150. Well, if you were to receive a prepayment from the customer for the $150, in a cash basis system, you would record the $150 as revenue. If you didn't go on to purchase the table in that same period, your income statement would show $150 in revenue with no offsetting expenses. So it would lead you to believe that you had $150 in profit, which you really didn't. In an accrual basis accounting system, you would show the revenue of $150 and the expense of $100 for the purchase of the table. Therefore, you're matching the expenses with the revenue. And the reason that accrual basis accounting can do this is because it parks a lot of transactions on the balance sheet until it can accurately move the expenses and the revenue and expenses to the income statement at the same time. That's why the balance sheet is so important in Studio Designer, because Studio Designer is an accrual basis accounting system, period. It is holding the revenue and the costs on the balance sheet until it moves them together to the income statement. And I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so let's look at this diagram that I hope will help resolve some of the mystery of Studio Designer. First, recognize that the item at the top is where everything starts. Nothing happens in Studio Designer in terms of purchasing items and reselling them to the customer. Nothing happens without an item being created. However, once that item is created, it takes two distinct paths, one being sold to the client and the other path being purchased from the vendor. Those two paths never intertwine. They are two separate routes. So let's look at the selling side, for instance. The selling side is where you can create, let me bring up my legend. The blue are documents and the purple are money transactions. So on the selling side, you can create client proposals and client invoices. You can receive money from the client in forms of a client deposit or a client payment. On the purchasing side, the document, you can enter a document called a vendor order, and you can record payments to the vendor through a vendor payment. I put the vendor invoice off to the side over here because unlike traditional accounting systems, you don't have a separate process for recording the fact that a vendor invoiced you. Studio Designer assumes that once the item is ordered, it's invoiced. There is a field to put the invoice number in the purchasing area, but it's not necessary and it doesn't change the accounting any. First, let me say that a client deposit, which is a payment that you receive on a proposal, creates a red client deposit. And what is a red client deposit? It's a liability on your balance sheet. And what do I mean by create? I mean it gives that account a balance. The account actually already exists in Studio Designer, but has no balance in it until you receive a client deposit. A client invoice, oops, I got ahead of my clicker, but I'm looking at the client invoice, which creates an asset of accounts receivable. Then a client payment relieves accounts receivable. And by relieve, I mean it reverses it. The $100, or in the case of that table, the $150 that I invoiced the client creates an asset in accounts receivable. And then when I receive payment from the client, it is moved from accounts receivable to cash. A vendor order creates two balances. It creates an asset called vendor deposit, and it creates a liability called accounts payable. Once the vendor payment is entered, it relieves accounts payable, and it relieves it either by moving it into it's either a reduction of cash or it's an increase in a credit card liability. The thing to note is all of those bubbles, everything you're doing up here has nothing to do with your income statement. The only thing that moves revenue and expenses to your income statement is a client invoice. It moves the client deposit liability to revenue and the vendor deposit asset to cost of goods sold. Up until this point, your income statement is essentially empty, and all of these transactions are sitting on the balance sheet. So in summary, when you're working with Studio Designer, if you can only remember 3 things, remember this: stay on top of Studio Designer. It can get messy very quickly. Don't batch transactions and decide you're going to enter them later. I would use the system as a part of your workflow and stay on top of it. Don't ignore the balance sheet. That is where transactions go to die. Studio Designer uses it extensively, and if you don't watch it, your balance sheet will be full of inaccurate information, which of course means your income statement is inaccurate. And lastly, your income statement isn't doing you any good until you create a client invoice for the item. And notice I said client invoice. It's the invoicing to the client that will pull the revenue to your income statement and the cost of goods sold to your income statement. Otherwise, all of that financial information sits on the balance sheet and the income statement basically stays at zero. So hopefully this is helpful of giving you an overview of what you need to watch for in Studio Designer. If you'd like copies of the slides or you'd like to see videos on other Studio Designer topics, just send me an email at info@bizhippo.com. Again, I'm Caroline DeVoy, and thank you.